Victor Harlan grabbed the handles of Dorothy's wheelchair and shoved it hard toward the front door. Not gently, not with hesitation. He pushed like he was taking out the trash. Dorothy's hands flew to the armrests. Her coffee cup hit the floor. Scout was on his feet before the ceramic stopped spinning, body low, eyes locked on Victor's hands. "Sign the deed or get out," Victor said. "Those are your only two choices." Dorothy looked at him. 78 years old, and she had never once believed her own family could become the most dangerous thing in her life. Until tonight. Before we go any further, tell me what city you're watching from. Drop it in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe that real loyalty never walks away, subscribe to this channel and stay with me until the very last word. Victor Harlan had been living in Dorothy's house for 11 months. He arrived after her husband passed, presenting himself as the responsible nephew, the one who cared, the one who would make sure she was taken care of. Dorothy had believed him. She had no reason not to. She had spent 40 years teaching second-grade reading at Clover Ridge Elementary, and in all that time, she had operated on the fundamental conviction that people were mostly good, mostly trying, mostly worth the benefit of the doubt. That belief had served her well for decades. Tonight, it had nearly cost her everything. The house on Sycamore Lane had been hers and Edmund's for 31 years. Edmund Harlan had built the back porch himself, 2 summers before his knees gave out for good. He had planted the 2 oak trees in the front yard the week their son Aaron was born. Aaron had grown up in that house, learned to ride a bike in that driveway, left from that front door on his first day with the Clover Ridge Sheriff's Department. He never came home from his last shift. A drunk driver on the county highway 3 years ago had seen to that. Dorothy still kept Aaron's deputy photograph on the mantel, and every morning she said good morning to it, the way she once said good morning to him. After Edmund died, the house became too quiet. Victor had seemed like an answer to that silence. He was Edmund's sister's son, polished and quick-talking, always with a reason and always with a plan. He said he was between contracts. He said he would help with the bills. He said Dorothy shouldn't have to manage all of this alone. And for the first 3 months, it was fine. He drove her to appointments. He handled the mail. He fixed the leaking faucet in the hall bathroom and told her to rest. Then things began to shift. The mail started arriving already opened. When Dorothy mentioned it, Victor said the post office had been doing that it was nothing, that she shouldn't worry. He added a second lock to the front door and kept the only key. He told her it was for her safety, that break-ins had been happening in the neighborhood. Dorothy had not heard about any break-ins, but she was tired and her hips still ached from the surgery. And she told herself she was being suspicious without cause. Scout had not believed that for a single day. Scout was a 7-year-old German shepherd with a tan and black coat and eyes the color of dark amber. He had been Aaron's canine partner for 4 years before the accident. After Aaron died, the department had honored Aaron's written request that Scout be transferred to family care, specifically to Dorothy. She had taken him in without question. She would have taken him in even without the paperwork, without the department's blessing, without anything except the fact that Scout was the last living piece of Aaron's daily life. From the first week Victor moved in, Scout watched him differently than he watched anyone else. Not with aggression, with attention. The kind of sustained, unblinking focus that said he was tracking something the rest of the room hadn't noticed yet. Victor called it unsettling. He told Dorothy that dogs like Scout were unpredictable, that a working dog without a handler was essentially a liability. Dorothy had told him, quietly but without room for argument, that Scout was not going anywhere. Victor had smiled then and let it go. At the time, Dorothy thought she had won something. She understood now that he had simply decided to wait. The pension checks began redirecting 6 months in. Dorothy only discovered it because her pharmacist called to say her automated prescription renewal had been declined for non-payment. When she asked Victor about it, he showed her a stack of papers, explained something about automatic billing cycles and account consolidations, and spoke fast enough that the explanation blurred before she could follow it. She signed where he pointed. Later, she would realize she hadn't been confused. She had been managed. He took her phone 2 weeks before the night he pushed her out the door. He said she had been calling people too often, that it was making her seem disoriented, that her neighbors were concerned. She asked which neighbors. He said all of them. She did not believe him, but her phone was gone before she could call anyone to confirm the lie. On the night it ended, Victor came home late. Dorothy heard his car in the driveway, heard him moving through the kitchen, heard the particular sound of cabinet drawers opening and closing that meant he was looking for something specific. Scout lifted his head from beside her chair. His ears went forward. He did not relax when Victor entered the living room. Victor set a folder on the coffee table. He sat across from Dorothy with the practiced ease of someone who had been rehearsing this. "We need to talk about the house," he said. Dorothy looked at the folder. "What about it?" "It's too much for one person to manage."
You know that.
He spread his hands. "I've been handling everything for almost a year now. The bills, the taxes, the maintenance. You need a proper arrangement, something legal, something that protects both of us." Dorothy did not touch the folder. "I manage my house fine." Victor's expression did not change. "You haven't managed anything in 8 months. I have." He pushed the folder closer. "This is a deed transfer. My name goes on the property. You stay here, nothing changes. You just don't have the burden of ownership anymore." Scout stood up. Dorothy looked at the dog, then back at Victor. "No," she said. "Dorothy?" "I said no. This house belonged to Edmund. It belongs to Aaron's memory. It belongs to me, and it will not have your name on it." Victor leaned back. Something cooled in his expression, the way a room cools when a window opens in winter. "Then we have a problem," he said. "The only problem I see," Dorothy replied, "is the one sitting across from me." That was when Victor stood up. That was when his voice dropped. "You have 1 hour to pack whatever fits in that old suitcase in the hall closet. You can take the dog. Nobody wants him anyway." He crossed toward her. "Or you sign tonight and we move on. But you are not staying in this house without putting my name on it. Not one more day." Dorothy gripped the armrests of her wheelchair and looked at him without blinking. "Edmund built this house. Aaron grew up in it. I buried them both, and I am still here. I will not sign anything, and I will not leave." Victor reached past her and picked up the folder. He walked to the front door and opened it. The night came in cold and immediate. "Suit yourself," he said. Scout moved to Dorothy's side. His shoulder pressed against the wheel of her chair and stayed there. Victor returned with the suitcase from the hall closet. He dropped it at her feet. He did not look at her when he did it. He was already on his phone, already moving on to whatever came next in his mind, already treating her removal as a logistical step that had been completed. Dorothy looked down at the suitcase. She recognized it. She had used it on the trip she and Edmund took to Savannah for their 25th anniversary. The handle was still wrapped in a strip of red electrical tape Edmund had put there so they could identify it on the baggage carousel. She packed slowly. Scout watched every movement Victor made. Victor did not come back into the room until Dorothy had zipped the suitcase closed. He wheeled her to the front door himself. He did it quickly, the way people do things they want to finish before they can think too carefully about them. He set the suitcase on the porch. He stepped back inside. He did not say anything else. The door closed. The deadbolt turned. Dorothy sat on her own porch in the October cold with one suitcase and a German shepherd standing in front of her like a wall. Scout did not whine. He did not pace. He placed himself between her and the door, and he held that position with the steady certainty of an animal that had been trained to understand one thing above all others. You do not leave the one you were given. Dorothy wrapped the leash once around her wrist. The leather was worn soft from years of handling. Aaron's hands had held this same leash, on this same porch, on every morning of his last 4 years. She pressed her fingers around it and held on. The porch light went out. Victor had switched it off from inside. Dorothy sat in the dark with Scout beside her, and the cold pressing in from every direction. And she did not cry. She had used up crying at 2 funerals in 3 years. What she felt now was something older and quieter than grief. It was the particular loneliness of someone who realizes that the danger was never outside the house. It was living in it, eating at her table, opening her mail, and smiling at her over coffee every single morning. Scout pressed his side harder against her wheel, and somewhere across town, a patrol cruiser turned onto the county road, its headlights cutting a slow path through the dark. The cold had settled into Dorothy's hands by the time the headlights appeared. She had been sitting at the edge of the driveway for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 30 minutes. Long enough for her fingers to go stiff around the leash. Long enough for Scout to reposition himself 3 times, each time pressing closer to her wheel, as if he understood that warmth was something she needed, and he was the only source available. Cars had passed, 4 of them. Not one had slowed. Dorothy had watched each set of headlights approach with the involuntary hope of someone who knows better but can't stop themselves. And each time the car accelerated past without hesitation, something in her chest dropped just a fraction lower than before. She was not the kind of woman who expected strangers to stop. She had lived long enough to know that most people decided very quickly that someone else's crisis was not their emergency. Scout heard the cruiser before she saw it. His ears rotated forward in that precise, mechanical way that had always reminded her of Aaron. Aaron used to say that Scout processed sound the way a radar dish processed signal, constantly sweeping, constantly sorting. The dog's body shifted from resting tension to active attention in one seamless motion, and Dorothy followed his gaze down the road to a single set of headlights moving slower than the others. Deliberate, controlled. Not in a hurry, but not drifting either. The cruiser eased to a stop 10 yards away. The engine idled. For a moment, nothing happened, and Dorothy felt Scout's breathing change beneath her hand, deeper and more focused, the way it changed when he was deciding something. Then the driver's door opened. Officer Ryan Caldwell stepped out into the cold. He was young. That was the first thing Dorothy registered. Young in the way that made her think of Aaron at the start of his career. That particular combination of alertness and composure that rookies worked very hard to wear correctly, and veterans wore without thinking about it at all. This one wore it naturally. She noted that. His dark navy uniform caught the faint light. Badge visible, one hand resting loosely near his belt without any urgency in it. He stopped at a respectful distance. He looked at her. He looked at Scout. His eyes moved between them the way someone's eyes move when they are reading a situation, rather than reacting to one. "Evening," he said. His voice was steady and low. "I got a welfare call for this area. You doing all right out here?" Scout barked once. Sharp, loud, deliberate. Not a warning, not aggression, A signal. Ryan did not flinch. He did not step back. He watched Scout for 3 full seconds with the quiet attention of someone who understood that a dog's behavior was information. "That dog trained?" he asked. Dorothy's throat felt rough from the cold. "Yes," she said. "He was my son's." Something moved in Ryan's expression. A small adjustment, barely visible. He took one careful step closer, keeping his body angled sideways, non-confrontational, respecting the invisible boundaries Scout had drawn around the wheelchair without anyone having to explain it to him. "What's his name?" Ryan asked. "Scout." Ryan nodded slowly. He crouched down to Dorothy's level, elbows on his knees, unhurried. "And yours, ma'am?" "Dorothy Harlan." "Mrs. Harlan." He said it like he was committing it to memory. "Can you tell me what happened tonight?" Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. She had spent weeks being managed and dismissed and spoken over, and she had learned to be careful about what she said and to whom. But there was something in the way this young officer held still, something in the way he waited without filling the silence, that reminded her of Edmund. Edmund had always said that the people worth trusting were the ones who could sit with quiet. "My nephew put me out," she said. "Tonight. About an hour ago." Ryan's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Put you out as in asked you to leave? Or put you out as in physically removed you from the property?" "He wheeled me to the door and left me on the porch," Dorothy said. "Then he locked it behind him." Ryan was quiet for 2 seconds. "Is the house in your name?" "It's my house. Edmund and I bought it in 1993. Ryan stood. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket and uncapped a pen. "Victor Harlan," he said. "That the nephew?" Dorothy blinked. "How did you know his name?" "Dispatch pulled the address. His name came up as a secondary resident." Ryan's voice was even, but his pen was moving. "Does he have any legal ownership of the property? Deed, transfer, power of attorney, anything like that?" "No," Dorothy said. "He wanted me to sign a deed transfer tonight. I refused. That's why he did this." Ryan stopped writing. He looked at her over the notebook. "He asked you to sign a deed transfer? And when you said no, he evicted you?" "Yes." Ryan closed the notebook. "Do you have a phone? Anyone I can call for you?" Dorothy shook her head. "He took my phone 2 weeks ago. Said I was confusing people." Ryan looked at her for a moment, and Dorothy recognized the expression. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. The look of someone who had heard a variation of this story before and understood exactly what pattern it belonged to. "All right," he said quietly. "One step at a time." He walked back to the cruiser. Dorothy watched him open the rear door. A German shepherd dropped to the ground with practiced ease, dark tan and black coat, amber eyes already scanning. The dog moved to Ryan's left side without a command and matched his pace exactly as Ryan walked back toward Dorothy. Scout's entire posture shifted. He did not growl. He did not advance. But he raised his head higher and his chest seemed to expand slightly, and the two dogs regarded each other across 6 feet of cold air with the particular intensity of animals establishing terms. Ryan stopped. "This is Atlas," he said. "He won't come any closer unless I tell him to." Atlas sat without being asked. Scout watched him for 5 seconds. Then he turned back toward Dorothy, which was the only confirmation Ryan needed that the situation was stable. "Mrs. Harlan," Ryan said, "I'm going to run the property records right now from my cruiser. I want to confirm what we're dealing with before we do anything else. You'll be able to see me from here the whole time. You're not alone." Dorothy nodded once. "Thank you." Ryan looked at her steadily. "You don't have to thank me yet. Let me earn it first." He returned to the cruiser. Dorothy heard the faint sound of keystrokes and the quiet electronic murmur of a database loading. Atlas remained seated 3 feet from Scout, with the self-contained patience of a working dog that understood waiting as part of the job. Scout watched the cruiser. Dorothy watched Scout. The cold pressed in from all sides. 60 seconds passed. Then Ryan was out of the cruiser again, and the way he moved was different, faster, purposeful. He crossed to Dorothy and crouched down to her level, and his expression had the carefully contained quality of someone holding something significant behind a professional face. "The property is titled solely to Dorothy Ann Harlan," he said. "Your name. No co-owner, no transferred interest, no lien, no power of attorney on file. Victor Harlan has no legal claim to that house." Dorothy closed her eyes. She had known it. She had known it every time Victor moved papers around and spoke too fast and used too many technical terms. But hearing it said plainly by someone with no reason to lie to her was something different entirely. The truth had weight when it came from a source that hadn't been managing her. "She told me I was confused," Dorothy said quietly. "You're not confused," Ryan replied. "What you are is the homeowner, and you were illegally removed from your own property tonight." He paused. "That's a crime, Mrs. Harlan. I need you to understand that." Dorothy opened her eyes. She looked at him directly for the first time. "He won't take that well." "I'm not asking him to take it well," Ryan said. "I'm asking him to take it legally." He reached back into the cruiser and pulled up another screen. His expression shifted again, and this time the containment in it was harder to maintain. He turned the tablet slightly so Dorothy could see. "I ran Scout's K-9 registration," he said. Dorothy leaned forward slightly. "He's registered under Deputy Aaron Harlan, Clover Ridge Sheriff's Department, K-9 Unit. Active status at time of handler's death. There's a note here from the department commander approving permanent family transfer to Dorothy Harlan upon handler's death." Ryan looked at her. "Scout is legally yours. He cannot be removed, resold, or transferred without your consent and a court order." Dorothy felt something tighten in her throat. "I already knew that." "I know," Ryan said. "But here's what you didn't know." He scrolled down. His voice was level, but his jaw was set. 3 weeks ago, a private canine contracting company called Ridgeline Working Dogs submitted a transfer evaluation request for Scout. The request listed the owner as Victor Harlan. He paused. "There's a payment record attached. $2,800. Deposit received." The leash went slack in Dorothy's hands. She had known Victor wanted rid of Scout. She had known it from the first week, from the way he looked at the dog, the way people look at things they've already decided are in the way. She had thought it was impatience. She had thought it was the irritation of a man who didn't like animals. She had not thought it was a transaction. "He was going to sell him," she whispered. "He already started the process," Ryan said. Scout turned his head and looked directly at Dorothy then, the way he sometimes did when her breathing changed, as if her body's distress was a frequency only he was tuned to receive. She pressed her hand against the top of his head and felt him lean into it. Ryan stood up. He looked at the house at the end of the block, with the lights still on inside, and his voice when he spoke again carried the specific quiet of someone who had made a decision. "Mrs. Harlan," he said, "we're going back to your house tonight. Right now." He looked at her. "Are you ready?" Dorothy straightened in her chair. She adjusted her grip on the leash. She thought of Edmund's porch. She thought of Aaron's photograph on the mantel. She thought of 40 years of second graders she had taught to read their first real sentences, and the patience it had taken, and the certainty she had always held that words meant things, and facts were facts, and the truth did not stop being true just because someone powerful decided to ignore it. "I've been ready," she said. "I've been ready since he closed that door." Ryan nodded. He reached for his radio. Atlas rose without a command and moved to Ryan's left side. Scout pressed against Dorothy's wheel, and the four of them turned toward the house on Sycamore Lane. Ryan knocked on the door of 14 Sycamore Lane with 3 firm raps. Not aggressive, not tentative. The knock of someone who intended to be heard and had the authority to back it up. Atlas sat at his left heel. Scout held position beside Dorothy's wheelchair. Nobody moved. The porch light was still off, the one Victor had switched off from inside when he left Dorothy in the dark. And Ryan had noted that detail and written it down and filed it in the part of his mind that tracked small cruelties. 10 seconds passed. Then the lock turned, and the door opened, and Victor Harlan stood in the frame, with the expression of a man who had expected to sleep soundly tonight, and was furious to discover he would not. He was tall, mid-40s, the kind of man whose confidence came from never having been seriously challenged. He looked at Ryan first, then at Atlas, then at Dorothy sitting behind Ryan's shoulder, and something moved across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite fear, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "What is this?" Victor said. Not a question, a complaint. "Mr. Harlan," Ryan said, "I'm Officer Caldwell, Clover Ridge PD. I need to speak with you about the property at this address." "This is my residence," Victor said. "Whatever she told you, she's confused. She gets confused. Her doctor will tell you the same thing." Ryan did not move. "Do you have documentation of that? A medical assessment, a guardianship filing, anything like that?" Victor paused, just one beat too long. "That's not the point." "It actually is the point," Ryan said. "Because right now the county property record shows this home is titled solely to Dorothy Ann Harlan. No co-ownership, no transfer, no power of attorney on file. Which means the person with legal authority to be inside this house is sitting in that wheelchair, not standing in this doorway." Victor's eyes moved to Dorothy. His voice dropped to something that was meant to sound reasonable and landed closer to threatening. "Dorothy, come inside and we can talk about this like adults. You don't need the police involved in a family matter." Dorothy looked at him evenly. "You made it a legal matter when you changed my locks and took my phone and put me on the curb." Victor turned back to Ryan. "She's been unstable since her son died. She misremembers things. She misinterprets things. I have been taking care of her for almost a year, and this is what I get." Ryan looked at him steadily. "Can you show me a signed power of attorney?" Silence. "Can you show me any legal document that gives you authority over this property or this woman's affairs?" More silence. "Then here's where we are," Ryan said. "Mrs. Harlan is returning to her home tonight. You can make this cooperative, or you can make this complicated, but the outcome is the same either way." Victor's jaw worked. He stepped back from the door, not in welcome, in calculation. Ryan moved aside, and Dorothy wheeled herself forward, Scout moving with her in that seamless way he had, shoulder to wheel, constant and unbreakable. She crossed her own threshold for the first time in 2 hours, and the moment her wheels touched the hall floor, something in her posture changed. Her back straightened, her chin came up. She was not a guest. She was not returning. She was reclaiming. Victor stood against the wall and watched her, with a particular stillness of a man reassessing his options. Ryan stepped inside and closed the door behind Atlas, and the four of them were in the hall together. Ryan scanned the space without appearing to scan it, taking inventory the way he had been trained to, clocking exits, objects, the folder still sitting on the coffee table from where Victor had placed it hours earlier during his rehearsed presentation of the deed transfer. Ryan walked to the table and looked at the folder without touching it. "Is this the transfer document you asked her to sign?" Victor said nothing. "Mr. Harlan, I'm asking you a direct question. That's a private document between family members. In an elder abuse investigation, Ryan said, turning to face him, there are no private documents. The word investigation landed in the room and changed the temperature of it. Victor's composure, which had been cracking along the edges since the door opened, now showed something deeper. Not guilt necessarily. Fear of exposure, which sometimes looked the same and was always more useful. I haven't abused anyone, Victor said. His voice had lost some of its smoothness. I've been managing her affairs because she cannot manage them herself. She seemed to manage them fine when she told you no tonight, Ryan replied. Scout moved, not toward Victor. He repositioned himself in the center of the room in a way that placed him equidistant between Dorothy and the hallway leading deeper into the house. His eyes tracked Victor without pause. Victor noticed. He pointed at the dog. That animal has been a problem since day one. He is aggressive and unpredictable, and I want it on record that I've been living under threat. Ryan looked at Atlas, sitting calmly 2 feet away. He looked at Scout, standing without a sound, holding his position. He looked back at Victor. I've been watching both dogs since I arrived, Ryan said. Neither one of them has made an aggressive movement. Scout is doing exactly what a trained canine does in a high-stress environment. He's assessing and holding perimeter. A pause. If you're feeling threatened, Mr. Harlan, that's worth thinking about. Dogs like Scout don't track danger randomly. They track it specifically. Victor opened his mouth, closed it. Dorothy said quietly from behind Scout's shoulder, He never liked being alone in a room with you. I thought it was just his nature. I know better now. The folder was still on the table. Ryan photographed it without opening it, documenting its presence, its placement, the handwritten tabs on the interior sections. Standard procedure that felt anything but standard, given what it represented. An old woman's home, reduced to a transaction. A signature line at the bottom of a page she was supposed to sign under duress. Ryan's radio crackled. He stepped to the side and answered in a low voice, listened, replied, and when he turned back, his expression had shifted into something careful and deliberate. Mr. Harlan, he said, I need to ask you about Ridgeline working dogs. The change in Victor was immediate and involuntary. A flicker in the eyes, a slight adjustment of weight. Small things that lasted less than a second, but were precisely the kind of things Ryan had been trained to see. I don't know what you're talking about, Victor said. They're a private canine contracting company about 90 miles north of here, Ryan continued. 3 weeks ago, they received a transfer evaluation request for a canine registered to this address. The request listed you as the owner. He looked at Victor without expression. Along with a deposit, $2,800. The room went completely still. Dorothy's hand tightened on the leash. Scout turned his head and looked at her, reading the shift in her grip the way he read everything she did, as direct and legible as language. Victor straightened. That dog was a liability. I was exploring options. That's not illegal. Submitting a transfer request for an animal you don't own using a fraudulent ownership claim is, Ryan said. So is accepting payment for property that belongs to someone else. He paused to let that settle. That's theft, Mr. Harlan. Depending on how the district attorney reads the elder exploitation statute, it could be considerably more than that. Victor looked at Dorothy, and for a moment the mask came entirely off. No smoothness, no calculation, no managed tone. Just the raw and specific anger of a man who had arranged everything carefully and watched it come apart in one night because an old woman refused to sign a piece of paper. You have no idea what I gave up to come here, he said. The words came fast and ragged. A year of my life managing your bills, your appointments, your medication. You were falling apart, and I held this household together, and this is what you do? Call the police on family?" Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and absolute. "You held nothing together, Victor. You took it apart, piece by piece. And you thought by the time I noticed, there would be nothing left to take back." Victor turned away from her. A muscle moved in his jaw. He was recalibrating again, retreating into strategy. But the ground was different now, and he knew it. Ryan spoke into his radio again, gave the address, gave the case number, requested a deputy to assist with documentation. He kept his voice level and his eyes on Victor while he did it. Atlas rose from his seated position and padded silently to Ryan's left side. The movement was small, but it changed the geometry of the room. Victor looked at both dogs, and then at Ryan, and his options had narrowed to a corridor with only one exit. "Am I being arrested?" Victor said. "Not tonight," Ryan said. "Tonight you're going to leave this house voluntarily and allow Mrs. Harlan to remain in her own home. Tomorrow, a detective from Financial Crimes will contact you regarding the transfer document, the canine sale, and the pension redirections that county records flagged when I ran the account history 20 minutes ago." Silence cracked open in the room. Dorothy turned her head toward Ryan. "The pension." Ryan looked at her. His voice was careful. "There are 6 months of diverted deposits. The account they were redirected to is not yours." He held her gaze. "We're going to need to talk about everything, Mrs. Harlan. But tonight, I just need you inside your house." Dorothy closed her eyes. 6 months. She had been eating less, turning the heat down at night, telling herself the bills were just higher than she remembered. She had been managing. She had been so certain she was managing. And all along, her own money had been feeding someone else's account while she sat at the kitchen table, stretching every dollar and trusting the wrong person to tell her the truth. When she opened her eyes, they were dry. She was past tears. She was somewhere on the other side of them, in the hard, clear country where people end up when grief and fury arrive at the same time and cancel each other into pure resolve. Victor left without another word. He took his keys and his phone, and he walked out the front door with the particular speed of a man who understands that the slower he leaves, the worse it gets. Ryan stood in the doorway and watched him go. Atlas watched beside him. The cruiser parked outside had its lights on now, a second deputy arriving to document the scene. Dorothy was already moving through her own house. She went to the mantel first. Aaron's photograph was still there, undisturbed, his deputy's badge glinting in the frame beside it. She stopped in front of it and pressed 2 fingers gently against the glass. Scout sat down beside her wheelchair without being asked. His amber eyes were steady and warm, and entirely focused on her. Ryan crossed the room and stood a respectful distance away. He said nothing. Some moments did not need an officer. They needed a witness. After a long while, Dorothy lowered her hand from the photograph and looked at Ryan. "His name was Aaron," she said. "He was a good man and a good officer." "Yes, ma'am," Ryan said. "I know. I pulled his record tonight." A pause. "He trained Scout himself. The whole unit talked about that dog for years after the accident. Said they'd never seen a bond like it." Dorothy looked down at Scout. Scout looked back up at her. "He kept the promise," she said softly. "Aaron always said Scout would keep the promise." Ryan's radio crackled again. The deputy outside needed a signature on the documentation. Ryan looked at Dorothy, then at the door, then back at her. "I'll be right outside," he said. Dorothy nodded. Ryan walked toward the door. He was almost through it when Dorothy spoke again, her voice quiet enough that he almost missed it.
"Officer Caldwell," he turned. "My son would have liked you," she said.
Ryan stood in the doorway for a moment, with the cold at his back and the warmth of the house at his front, and something moved in his chest that he did not have a word for yet. He nodded once, then he stepped outside to do his job. Inside, Scout pressed his side against Dorothy's wheel and held still, and the house on Sycamore Lane, which had been dark and hostile and full of the wrong person's plans for far too long, finally began to feel like itself again. Dorothy did not sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen with the lights on and the blanket across her knees and Scout at her feet. And she listened to the house the way you listen to something you almost lost. Every creak of the settling walls, the refrigerator's low hum, the sound of wind pushing against the back windows. She had lived in this house for 31 years, and she knew every sound it made. And for the first time in 11 months, those sounds felt like company, instead of reminders of everyone who was no longer there to make noise with her. Ryan had stayed until nearly midnight. He had walked her through every room, documenting what was missing, what had been moved, what had been locked away in drawers that were now forced open and emptied. Edmund's files, her own banking records, a manila envelope she hadn't seen in 4 months that turned out to contain the original deed, her pension account information, and a notarized letter from Victor's own attorney outlining the terms of the fraudulent transfer he had been preparing since the 3rd month he lived under her roof. He had been planning this for 8 months, not improvising, planning. When Ryan finally left, he stood at the front door for a moment and looked at her with the expression of someone who wanted to say something and was choosing his words carefully. "Lock this behind me," he said. "Both locks. And if anything happens before morning, you call dispatch directly. My number is on the card I left on the table." Dorothy had locked both locks. She had held the key in her palm for a long moment before setting it down, just to feel the weight of it. Her key, her locks, her door. Now it was nearly 6 in the morning, and the sky outside was beginning to pale at the edges, and Dorothy was on her 2nd cup of tea, and Scout had not moved from the floor beside her chair, except once, around 3 in the morning, when a car had passed slowly on the street outside, and he had risen and positioned himself between her and the front of the house, with his ears fully forward until the sound faded. Then he had returned to the floor and settled back down without any drama, as if guarding her through the night was simply the next item on a list he intended to complete. The knock came at 7:15. Scout was up before Dorothy's tea reached the table, but his posture was different from the night before. Less threat assessment, more alertness. He moved to the door and stood rather than positioning himself as a barrier, and Dorothy had learned to read the difference. She opened the door. Detective Sandra Okafor was in her late 40s, a compact woman with close-cropped hair and the kind of direct, unhurried energy that made you feel simultaneously at ease and accountable. She wore a gray blazer, a county ID clipped to her lapel, and an expression that communicated she had already read every document Ryan filed the night before and had questions that could not wait until business hours. She looked at Scout first. "Former canine?" she said. "Yes," Dorothy said. "My son's." Okafor nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "May I come in?" She sat across from Dorothy at the kitchen table and opened a slim folder and did not waste time. "Mrs. Harlan, I specialize in financial exploitation cases targeting elderly residents. Officer Caldwell's report flagged several elements that fall directly within my jurisdiction. I need to go through them with you this morning and I need you to tell me everything you remember, not just what you think is relevant. You decide what's relevant, and you'll leave things out that I need. So I want everything." Dorothy appreciated that. She had spent 11 months being told what was relevant and what wasn't, by a man with reasons for keeping her uninformed. She talked for 40 minutes. Okafor wrote steadily and interrupted only to ask for dates, amounts, the specific phrasing Victor had used when he offered explanations. She was particularly interested in the pension redirections, and the more Dorothy recalled, the darker Okafor's expression became. Not with sympathy, with the focused anger of a professional who had seen this pattern executed against too many people and was done watching it succeed. When Dorothy finished, Okafor closed the folder and looked at her directly. "I want to be straightforward with you, because you've had enough people be indirect. Victor Harlan diverted approximately $14,000 from your accounts over 6 months. He initiated a fraudulent property transfer using a forged cognitive assessment that listed you as mentally incompetent. He sold a registered law enforcement animal he did not own, and he systematically isolated you from outside communication to prevent exactly what happened last night." She paused. "That is not a family dispute. That is a criminal case." Dorothy's hands were very still on the table. $14,000, she said. "We'll recover as much as we can," Okafor said, "but I need you to be prepared for the process to take time." "How much time?" "Months, possibly longer." Okafor's voice was steady. "But Mrs. Harlan, he will be charged. I want you to hear that clearly. This is not going away because he's family." Scout put his chin on Dorothy's knee. She looked down at him and pressed her hand against the top of his head and held it there. $14,000. She had turned the heat down in January because she thought she couldn't afford the bill. She had been eating oatmeal for breakfast 5 days a week because she thought she was being careful. She had thanked Victor for managing things so efficiently. She breathed in slowly, then out. Scout's head was warm under her palm. "What do you need from me?" she said. Okafor reached back into her folder and produced a series of documents. "I need your signature on a formal complaint. I need you to authorize account access for the forensic review. And I need a written statement detailing the phone confiscation, the lock changes, and the deed transfer demand." She laid a pen on the table beside the papers. "Take your time reading everything." Dorothy picked up the pen. "I'm 78 years old, Detective. I know how to read a document." She pulled the first page toward her. "And I'm done taking my time." She had signed the third page when her hand stopped moving. She had seen a name in the body of the complaint form, standard language that outlined the parties involved, and one detail had surfaced that Okafor had not yet mentioned. A co-respondent. A second name attached to the petition for the fraudulent cognitive assessment. Dorothy looked up. "Who is Dr. Preston Webb?" Okafor was quiet for 1 second. "He's a licensed clinical psychologist with a private practice in Hartwell County. His signature appears on the cognitive impairment assessment Victor used to support the deed transfer application." She met Dorothy's gaze. "He signed a document declaring you mentally incompetent to manage your own affairs. We have no record that he ever met with you or conducted any evaluation." The room went very still. Dorothy set the pen down. "He declared me incompetent. A man who has never seen my face." "We believe he was paid to sign it," Okafor said. "His name has appeared in 2 other elder exploitation cases in this region in the past 18 months. Both involved property transfers. Both involved clients who were isolated before the filing." She paused. "We are investigating him separately, but his involvement in your case strengthens the charges against Victor significantly." Dorothy stared at the name on the page. Dr. Preston Webb, a stranger in an office somewhere, who had looked at a check and decided that a woman he had never spoken to was incompetent. Who had lent his license and his signature to the erasure of a person who was sitting at her own kitchen table right now, sharp and present and angrier than she had been in years. He signed a lie, Dorothy said. Yes, Okafor said simply. He did. Dorothy picked the pen back up. Then let's make sure the truth has more signatures than his lie does. She finished the documents in 12 minutes. Okafor gathered everything efficiently, tucked the folder under her arm, and stood. At the door she paused, a habit Dorothy had noticed in both her and Ryan. This tendency to stop at the threshold, as if they wanted to say one more thing before the official part ended. Mrs. Harlan, Okafor said, I've handled over 60 cases like yours in this county. People who were managed out of their own lives so quietly they didn't realize what had happened until it was too late. She looked at Dorothy steadily. You caught it. You said no when it mattered. That is not nothing. Dorothy thought about the night before. The cold, the dark, the door that locked behind her, the cars that didn't stop. I didn't catch it, she said. I just refused to let it finish. Okafor almost smiled. Same thing, she said. She left. Dorothy closed the door, both locks, and stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand resting on the wood. Scout appeared at her side, pressing against the wheel of her chair, amber eyes patient and warm. Ryan arrived an hour later, off duty, in a dark jacket and plain clothes. He had a paper bag from the bakery 2 blocks away, and a sheaf of printed documents he set on the table without preamble. County Sheriff co-signed Scout's registration this morning, he said. I called in a favor. His status is now permanently attached to your address. No court order, no transfer, nothing moves him without your consent and a judge's signature. Dorothy looked at the documents. She looked at Ryan. He was young enough to be her grandson, standing in her kitchen on his day off, carrying printed paperwork from a county office that he had clearly called the moment it opened. Sit down, she said. I'll make you tea. Ryan looked like he was going to decline on reflex, the professional instinct to stay efficient and not impose. Then something shifted in his expression, and he pulled out a chair and sat down. Thank you, he said. Dorothy filled the kettle. Scout walked to Ryan's side and sat down next to his chair with the easy confidence of an animal that had already made its assessment and recorded its conclusion. Ryan looked down at him, then slowly lowered his hand. Scout pushed his nose against Ryan's palm once, brief and deliberate, then looked away. Ryan's throat moved. Dorothy did not comment on it. She understood what it meant for a working dog to offer that. She understood what it meant for a young officer to receive it from a dog that had belonged to another officer who was no longer here. She set the tea on the table and sat across from him. Your father was a firefighter, she said. Ryan looked at her. How did you know that? You said last night that some calls don't end when the shift does. She wrapped her hands around her mug. That's not something they teach you. That's something you hear at home. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He died when I was 19, he said. On the job. Dorothy nodded slowly. I joined the force 2 years later, he said. People thought I was trying to be him. I wasn't. He paused. I just didn't know what else to do with what he taught me. The kettle settled. The house was quiet. Scout lay down across both their feet, a warm and solid weight, exactly where he intended to be. Dorothy looked at this young man sitting at her kitchen table with his tea cooling in front of him. And she thought about Aaron, and she thought about Edmund, and she thought about all the people she had loved, who had understood, without being told, where they were supposed to stand. You knew exactly what to do, she said softly. Ryan looked up at her. Last night, she said, You knew." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet and honest. "I just didn't leave," he said. Dorothy nodded. That was enough. Victor Harlan was arrested on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after he pushed Dorothy's wheelchair out the front door and turned off the porch light. Dorothy heard about it from Detective Okafor, who called at 8:15 and delivered the news in the same direct, unhurried way she delivered everything. He was taken into custody at 6:40 this morning. Charges include elder financial exploitation, unlawful eviction, fraudulent property transfer, forgery of a medical assessment, and theft by deception in connection with the K9 sale. A brief pause. Dr. Preston Webb was arrested at his Hartwell County office 30 minutes later. Conspiracy to commit fraud and falsification of a professional evaluation. Dorothy was sitting at the kitchen table when the call came. Scout was at her feet. She held the phone against her ear and looked at Aaron's photograph on the mantel, and felt something move through her that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but carried elements of both. "Thank you, Detective," she said. "You did the hard part," Okafor said. "You said no." After she hung up, Dorothy sat quietly for a long time. Scout put his chin on her knee. She rested her hand between his ears and breathed slowly, in and out, letting the information settle the way you let something heavy settle before you try to lift it. 11 months. She had lived under the same roof as a man who was systematically dismantling her life, and she had blamed herself for the confusion, had told herself she was tired and grieving and adjusting. She had apologized to Victor more than once for being difficult. She thought about that now, those apologies, and they sat in her chest like stones she intended to put down and never pick up again. She picked up Ryan's card from the table and called his number. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Hyland." "They arrested him," she said. A beat of silence. Then, quietly, "Good. I wanted you to know first," she said. "I appreciate that." His voice carried something careful in it, something that sounded like it was working hard to stay professional and not entirely succeeding. "How are you doing?" Dorothy considered the question honestly, the way she had started doing everything since the night on the driveway. Without performance, without the reflexive fine that women her age had been trained to produce, regardless of the actual answer. "I'm sitting at my kitchen table in my house," she said. "Scout is here. The heat is on. I slept in my own bed last night." She paused. "I think I'm doing better than I have in a long time." Ryan was quiet for a moment. "I'll stop by later this week," he said, "if that's all right." "I'll have tea ready," Dorothy said. She ended the call and looked around her kitchen. The heat was on. She had turned it up the morning after Victor left, all the way to where she actually wanted it. And she had stood in the warmth of her own house and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been clenched for months. The news moved through Clover Ridge the way news moved through small towns, quietly and completely, through phone calls and front porch conversations, and the particular grapevine of people who had known each other long enough to care about what happened to their neighbors. By Wednesday, Dorothy had received 4 casseroles, 2 pies, and a handwritten note from her neighbor Evelyn Marsh that said simply, "I should have knocked on your door sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." Dorothy wrote back and told her there was nothing to be sorry for. Then she called Evelyn and invited her for coffee. It was a small thing. It was also the first time Dorothy had invited someone into her home in 11 months. Victor had discouraged visitors, always with a reasonable explanation, always framed as protecting Dorothy's rest or managing her stress. She understood now that visitors asked questions, and questions were the one thing Victor could not afford. Evelyn arrived on Thursday morning with her own coffee cake and a woman she introduced as her friend Patricia, 71, recently widowed, who had driven over from the neighboring street because Evelyn had told her about Dorothy and Patricia had said she needed to meet her. "Evelyn says you stood your ground," Patricia said, settling into the kitchen chair across from Dorothy, with the directness of someone who had stopped being indirect somewhere around age 65. "I just said no," Dorothy said. Patricia shook her head. "You'd be surprised how many people can't do that, even when they know they should. Even when everything in them is saying to fight back." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "My husband's nephew spent 2 years convincing Harold that I was managing the finances wrong. By the time Harold died, 3 accounts had been quietly redirected." Her jaw tightened. "I never got most of it back." Dorothy looked at her. "Did you report it?" "I tried," Patricia said. "Nobody listened the way your Officer Caldwell listened." The words landed quietly, but they landed hard. Dorothy thought about Ryan crouching beside her wheelchair in the cold, asking her questions and writing down the answers, treating every word she said as fact rather than confusion. She thought about how different the night would have gone if a different officer had taken that call. Someone who pulled up, saw an old woman in a wheelchair and a large dog, decided it was a family matter, and drove away. "He listened," Dorothy said. "That's all it took." Scout, who had been lying near the hallway, stood and walked to the table and settled between Dorothy and Patricia, with the calm assurance of a dog who had decided both women were his responsibility now. Patricia looked down at him with an expression Dorothy recognized because she had worn it herself. The expression of someone who needed to be near something steady and found it in an animal that asked nothing and gave everything. She reached down slowly. Scout did not move away. He waited, patient and still, while Patricia rested her hand on his shoulder, and then he exhaled once, long and quiet, as if to say that he had been expecting her. Patricia looked at Dorothy. Her eyes were bright. "He reminds me of Harold," she said. "The way he just knows where to be." Dorothy smiled. "My son taught him that." By the second week of November, 4 more women had come to the house on Sycamore Lane. Not organized, not planned, word of mouth and kitchen table conversations, and the quiet urgency of people who had been carrying something alone for too long and needed somewhere safe to put it down for an hour. Dorothy made tea and listened, and Scout moved from person to person with his unhurried attention, settling near whoever sat the quietest, which was always the one who needed it most. She had not meant to start anything. She had simply not turned anyone away. Ryan came by on a Friday afternoon, Atlas with him, both of them off duty. He knocked and waited, and when Dorothy opened the door, he took in the kitchen full of women and the extra chairs borrowed from the dining room, and Scout moving through the gathering like he owned the floor, which he did. And something in Ryan's expression shifted into a kind of quiet wonder. "I didn't know you were having people over," he said. "I didn't either," Dorothy replied, "until they started coming." He stayed for 40 minutes. He drank tea he didn't ask for, and answered questions from 3 different women who wanted to know exactly what rights they had if someone tried to change their locks or access their accounts without permission. He answered every question directly and completely, without condescension, without the careful vagueness that officials sometimes used when they didn't want to commit to anything. He told them what the law said, what to document, who to call, and what to say when they called. When he stood to leave, Patricia looked up at him from across the table. "You're a good officer," she said. Ryan picked up his jacket. "I'm trying to be," he said. Patricia shook her head. "No, you already are. Own it." Atlas, who had been sitting beside the back door, stood and pressed his nose briefly against Scout's forehead, in a gesture so brief and unself-conscious that Dorothy almost missed it. Scout did not react except to hold still and allow it. Then Atlas moved to Ryan's side, and they were at the door. Dorothy walked them out. On the porch, Ryan stopped and turned. The afternoon light was flat and gray and cold in the way that Tennessee Novembers carried themselves, and Dorothy pulled her sweater tighter across her shoulders. "Can I ask you something?" Ryan said. "Yes." "That night on the driveway." He looked at her steadily. "When I pulled up, you'd been sitting there for over an hour, alone, in the cold. No phone, no one stopping." He paused. "Were you scared?" Dorothy thought about it honestly, the way she had been thinking about everything honestly since the night Victor closed that door. "Yes," she said, "but not of the dark." She looked out at the empty street. "I was scared that I had spent 11 months doubting myself so completely that I had forgotten who I was." She looked back at Ryan. "That's a worse kind of scared than the cold." Ryan nodded slowly. "And now?" Dorothy was quiet for one moment. Then, with the particular certainty of a woman who had taught 40 years of children to trust the words in front of them and say them out loud without apology, she said, "Now I remember." The case against Victor Harlan moved through the courts with the methodical weight of evidence that had been carefully gathered and professionally documented. Okafor called every 3 weeks with updates. The accounts were forensically traced. The forged assessment was professionally dismantled. Dr. Preston Webb entered a guilty plea in December that strengthened the charges against Victor before his own trial date was set. The pension redirections were partially recovered. Not all of it. Okafor had told her honestly that not all of it would come back, and Dorothy had nodded and accepted that truth, the same way she accepted every hard truth, by looking at it directly without looking away. On the first Saturday of December, Ryan arrived with a printed photograph he had requested from the department archive. He handed it to Dorothy without ceremony. It was Aaron, young and sharp in his deputy's uniform, Scout sitting at perfect attention at his left side, both of them looking directly at the camera with the focused alertness of partners who had trained together long enough to move as one. Dorothy held the photograph in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Scout stood beside her and pressed his shoulder gently against her arm. She felt his warmth through her sleeve, solid and constant, the same way she had felt it every morning for 3 years, the same way she had felt it on a cold driveway in October, with no coat and no phone and a door locked against her. She had not broken then. She would not break now. That was the simple and complete truth of Dorothy Harlan. She set the photograph on the mantel beside Aaron's badge, and she stood in front of both of them with her hand resting on Scout's head. And she understood that the promise Aaron made the day he wrote Scout's transfer paperwork was not a contingency plan for a bad outcome. It was a declaration of who he was, the same declaration Edmund had made when he planted those oak trees the week Aaron was born, the same one Dorothy had made every morning for 40 years when she walked into a classroom of children who needed someone to believe they were worth the time. Love that chooses to stay is the only promise that matters. Aaron had known that. Edmund had known it. And Scout, who had refused to leave her side from the moment the door closed, who had stood between her and the road and the dark and the cold and the cruelty of a man who had calculated her worth and gotten the number wrong, had known it longest of all. Ryan stood in the hallway with Atlas at his side, watching, and he did not speak, because some moments did not need a witness who talked. They needed one who stayed. Dorothy turned from the mantel and looked at the young officer in her hallway and the dog at his side. And she thought about all the people who had moved through this house and left pieces of themselves behind. And she thought about how a house was not walls and floors, but the accumulation of every promise made inside it and kept. Then she straightened her shoulders, turned her wheelchair toward the kitchen, and said, "Come in, Officer Caldwell. The tea is already on." Scout led the way, unhurried and certain, exactly where he was supposed to be. In the house on Sycamore Lane, which had survived grief and theft, and the particular cruelty of a man who mistook age for weakness, held them all warmly, and did not let go.